Have you ever spent decades building a life with someone, only to realize they were willing to throw it all away for a fleeting thrill? This isn't just a story about infidelity. It's about the kind of betrayal that seeps in quietly like a slow-moving storm, until one day it shatters everything you thought was unbreakable. In this tale, you'll see how one man's world was torn apart and how he rebuilt himself piece by piece, not just to survive, but to thrive, and left his unfaithful wife with nothing but regrets. By the time you reach the end, you'll know exactly why his revenge was as cold as it was devastating. You're watching Cheating Stories 7. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe, like this video, and share your thoughts in the comments. Now, let's step into the story. She risked everything for a younger lover, but my revenge left her with nothing. I used to think happiness was a mosaic made from small, deliberate rituals. The first coffee before sunrise, its warmth seeping into my hands as the world still lay quiet. A morning jog along the slow bend of the river where mist rose like a curtain lifting from a stage. And without fail, the quick text to my wife, "You good?" Vanessa always replied, sometimes with a heart emoji, sometimes a sarcastic quip about the dean, and other times a picture of our dog curled up on the sofa. 23 years into our marriage, I believed we were still us. A little older, softer at the edges, but intact. With both our daughters moved out, the house had learned to breathe in our absence, and in the quiet, I thought we'd found each other again. Her college hosted its annual staff gathering in mid-September, a tradition wrapped in harmless familiarity. String lights draped across a brick courtyard, cheap sparkling wine in plastic flutes, and a student jazz trio playing softly in the background. I was at the buffet table when I heard her laugh, the same laugh I'd heard in kitchens on long road trips during private jokes no one else would get. It tugged at me in a way that was both comforting and grounding. And then I saw him, Julian Cross, the new, much-praised associate professor, younger, athletic. The kind of smile that pretends not to know it's handsome. Vanessa leaned toward him as she spoke, her body angling with an intimacy so subtle strangers might miss it, but not me. I told myself the easy stories. Maybe he was unusually witty, maybe the wine was stronger than it tasted, maybe she was just glowing under the lights. But every time she slipped from my sight in the crowd, I found her again by finding him. The touches were brief, shoulders brushing, her fingers grazing the stem of her glass while he talked, but each one lodged in me like a splinter. Twice I caught her laughing with the abandon she'd once saved for our early years. I could not remember the last time she had looked at me that way. Jealousy is a superstition, I told myself. It's fear pretending it can bend reality. So I refilled her drink, kissed her temple, and let her keep talking to him. She squeezed my hand without meeting my eyes. The thank you was in the squeeze. The distance was in the not looking. On the drive home, the evening replayed in fragments. I thought about the past 2 months, the sudden urgency in bed, the playlist shifting to faster, wilder beats. I had chalked it up to the empty nest rekindling us. Now it felt like something else entirely. I didn't accuse, I didn't pry, instead I began to watch. No trench coat, no theatrics, just a husband taking a closer look at the life he thought he knew. I noticed her phone living face down on the table, the secret smiles at messages she didn't share, the way she dressed with extra care on days she claimed to have meetings. A week later, another mixer. Julian was already there when we arrived, tie loosened, sleeves rolled, projecting effortless charm. I watched her lift her glass toward him before remembering to reach for mine. Later, in a quiet hallway, her fingers brushed his forearm as she spoke, and the smile he gave her was small, private, meant for her alone. It wasn't thunder. It was weather, a slow front moving in, shifting the light in every room. That night, I lingered in the hallway, staring at our wedding photos. My face that day, hers, the vows we had believed could hold forever. I didn't decide anything in that moment. Decisions are for daylight, but I made one quiet promise I would pay attention, not to confirm what I feared, but to see if our life could bear the weight of being truly seen. When I slipped back into bed, she stirred and pressed her back against my chest. My body remembered her shape. My heart remembered our history, but somewhere deep inside me, a new truth had begun to grow, and I knew it would not be ignored. The changes came the way a season shifts, slow enough to pretend you hadn't noticed, but undeniable once you did. Vanessa had always been warm and affectionate in our marriage, but she was rarely the one to close the distance first. That balance flipped almost overnight. Suddenly, she was the one pulling me in before the lights were dimmed, her hands tugging at my shirt, lips pressing hard against mine, her body moving with an urgency that felt, at first, like a gift, as if something had reawakened in her, as if we'd stumbled onto a secret door in a familiar house. But the connection had changed. What we had now was raw, almost mechanical, a fast burn where there used to be a slow, familiar heat that carried meaning in every touch. She was present physically, yes, but her eyes seemed fixed on something I couldn't see, like her mind was in a room I couldn't enter. At gatherings, the picture sharpened. Julian Cross was always there, orbiting close to her the way a shadow clings to light. No matter the seating arrangements, the milling of guests, or the flow of conversation, they drifted toward each other as if drawn by a current. I'd glance up from across the room and find them side by side, laughing at a joke I couldn't hear, their shoulders brushing in a way that looked casual only if you didn't know better. Sometimes it was her hand on his arm. Sometimes his palm rested briefly at the small of her back. Small gestures that on their own meant little, but together, stacked one atop another, they built a wall I could see but not cross. I wanted to believe I was imagining it, that what I felt was nothing more than insecurity looking for a shape. But there were moments, like when she leaned toward him in public in a way she no longer did with me, that made my gut knot tight. And when her smile lingered with him longer than necessary, I couldn't tell myself polite lies anymore. Still, I said nothing, not yet. Instinct told me that once the question left my mouth, once the air was split with an accusation, there would be no way back. So I stayed silent, a man living in a house that still looked like home but no longer felt entirely mine. I watched. I waited. I wondered how long I could pretend not to see what was happening right in front of me. It was a Tuesday, ordinary, forgettable, until it wasn't. I was at my desk, halfway through an afternoon of routine emails and project deadlines when a restless thought nudged me to open the Find My Phone app. I told myself it was habit, harmless, just a check. But when the map loaded, the pulsing dot labeled Vanessa's iPhone wasn't at the college campus. It was home. Vanessa never came home in the middle of the day, not without a reason. I stared at the screen, running through possibilities. Maybe she'd forgotten a folder. Maybe she wasn't feeling well. Maybe, but each excuse felt thinner than the last. My pulse began to quicken. 15 minutes later, I was pulling into the driveway, the tires rolling quietly over familiar asphalt. The house looked exactly as it always did, front blinds half drawn, the flower pots she loved still lined neatly by the porch. I slipped my key into the lock, turning it slow enough to keep the hinges from groaning. At first, there was silence. Then, faint but unmistakable, the rhythm of a bed frame meeting the wall, a muffled voice, male, and over it the sound that hollowed me out from the inside, Vanessa's voice, breathless, rising in a cadence I hadn't heard in years. I stood at the base of the stairs, every muscle rigid. Then I heard Julian's voice, low and coaxing, followed by Vanessa's gasp, words that struck harder than any fist. God, you're the best I've ever had. My hands curled into fists. Part of me wanted to storm the room, to drag him out, to see the fear in his eyes. I could already taste the raw satisfaction of violence. But then another image came, steel bars, a cell door slamming, the look on my daughters' faces when they heard what I'd done. I stepped back, one slow breath, then another. I left the house as quietly as I'd entered, pulling the door shut with a click soft enough not to carry upstairs. Outside, the autumn air felt sharper, cleaner. My heart still pounded, but the fire inside me was cooling into something else, something colder, more deliberate. This wasn't the moment for an explosion. Explosions are messy. They leave debris. No, this would be done methodically. No shouting match in the hallway, no tears on the staircase. I would dismantle her life with the same patience I had once used to build it. And so, in the shadow of my own home, I began the quiet, careful work of revenge. I loved my husband. That is the sentence I kept at the top of every page in my head, the headline that justified everything written beneath. I loved Ethan because he was kind without being weak, patient without being passive, and funny in a way that always landed exactly where I lived. 23 years is not a coincidence. We earned our ordinary. We built it. And then Julian appeared, like weather you can feel before you see. The first time he stood in my doorway, holding a stack of syllabi and asking about room assignments, something dangerous hummed under my skin. It wasn't fireworks and it wasn't fate either. More like a frequency only the two of us could hear. I did what a married woman is supposed to do when she feels a pull like that. I turned the dial. I smiled politely, answered his question, and sent him down the hall. But for the rest of the day, my hands would not stop shaking. The story I told myself was tidy. What I felt was harmless chemistry. I could honor my vows and still enjoy the attention of a younger colleague who saw me as radiant in ways I'd forgotten I could be. It was just oxygen, just a little color returning to a room I hadn't noticed had gone dim. I baked those lies at a low, slow heat until they were soft enough to swallow. When Ethan traveled overnight for a client meeting, I called Julian to meet for lunch. I chose a small Italian place where the light stayed kind and the servers never hurried you. We laughed too easily. I blushed like a student. I told myself it was the thrill of adult conversation, someone who shared my books, my jokes, my shorthand language of footnotes. I did not tell myself the truth, that the entire time we spoke, I was trying not to stare at his hands. I was the one who said my place. The one who pulled the garage door down, led him up the stairs, undressed first because I was terrified of rejection and wanted to beat him to it. Fear is a terrible compass. Pleasure is an even worse map. That afternoon, the world narrowed to a pulse and a ceiling I no longer recognized. When the room stopped spinning, I stacked rationalizations like dishes in the sink. This is a bubble. It doesn't touch anything else. Ethan is my life. This is just a body learning a new song. Compartmentalization is a miracle until it becomes a coffin. I learned to live in compartments. Mornings belonged to routine. The lunch hour belonged to risk. Evenings to domestic competence and the soft choreography Ethan and I had learned over 2 decades. I convinced myself I could be loyal with my heart while my body behaved like weather. I told myself that what Julian and I had was a laboratory of sensation, and that any guilt I felt was proof I was still good. Good people feel bad when they do bad things. See? I felt terrible. Therefore, I must still be good. But laboratories want longer hours, and longer hours require a cover story. I became efficient. I learned his schedule and mine, which colleague would sign off on administrative time without questions, which days the linen closet could hide a fresh set of sheets. I even kept a bottle of body wash in the scent Ethan described as you. With Julian, my body felt new again. I'm not proud of that sentence, but I am honest about it, because honesty used to be one of my values. He was attentive in ways that were purely physical, and therefore, I told myself, harmless. At home, I overcorrected. I initiated more with Ethan. I performed devotion like it was a sequence of persuasive acts. I told myself I was protecting him, protecting us. If he felt desired, he would feel safe. If he felt safe, the house would hold. The truth was uglier. I was laundering my guilt through his body. There were warnings. Once, during a faculty mixer, I let my fingers rest on Julian's forearm a beat too long. Another time, I caught my reflection in a window as I walked beside him, our steps perfectly in sync. The woman looking back at me seemed younger, hungrier, and a little haunted. I told myself I was in control because the alternative was admitting I'd lit a fire I couldn't put out. I promised myself I'd end it. After the next grading cycle, after the conference, after the holidays. Each date moved forward every time we said goodbye. What I didn't know, what I refused to imagine, was how thin the wall had become between compartments. You cannot carry 2 separate lives through the same doorway forever. Even the most careful choreography leaves scuff marks, a pillow out of place, a scent that isn't yours, a look you forget to smooth before walking inside. On the morning, it all began to tilt for good. I woke with a clarity so bright it felt like mercy. I would end it. Today. I would call Julian, silence the frequency, bring my life back into one piece. And then just before lunch, I heard the old song again, faint, irresistible, and followed it home. The morning after that Tuesday, the Tuesday I will never forget, I took inventory. Not of furniture or jewelry, but of what a man has left when the floor gives way, breath, patience, and paper. Paper most of all. Paper can outlast heat. I became quieter in my own home. Doors I once let swing now closed with the soft press of my hand. Footsteps that used to echo learned the edges of each stair. I spoke less, listened more. I learned the rhythm of Vanessa's longer showers. I timed the minutes she spent dressing when she came home at lunch. I noticed how her laugh shifted when she was on the phone with someone she pretended not to read messages from. The first move was a calendar, a blank one. I began marking it, green for days of business as usual, red for anomalies. Find My Phone gave me the coordinates. Twice the week before, home at noon, gone by 2, back at the office by 2:20 with damp hair and a changed blouse. 2 days later, home again, 12:15 to 1:50. Patterns are the handwriting of truth. Mine began to fill itself in. I met with a lawyer named Harding in an office that smelled faintly of old books and lemon oil. She had the gaze of a surgeon and the patience of a stone. She let me talk until my throat burned, then slid a legal pad across the desk. Facts, she said. Dates, times, screenshots, do not editorialize. Judges don't read poetry. So I gathered facts. I exported cell records, highlighting the nightly bursts from an unknown number, later matched to Julian's faculty extension, then to his private cell. I took photos of the bed when it looked wrong. Sheets tucked in a way I never tuck them, pillows flipped to the cool side on a winter morning. I photographed the dent left by a body that wasn't mine. It felt obscene and necessary, like documenting a crime scene in my own home. I learned the arithmetic of caution. I stopped using our shared desktop. I created a new email, plain and forgettable, to send files to myself. A thumb drive lived in my sock drawer, hidden inside a pair of wool socks she hated. Every night after Vanessa slept, I synced the day's evidence and labeled it with boring names. Invoice Jan. PDF, Insurance Form 2, PNG. Harding had told me to assume the other side might read anything I left lying around. My job was to build a record that could survive cross-examination and a house fire. Money speaks louder than romance in court, so I moved methodically. I pulled our credit card statements, circling the small Italian restaurant near campus, the rideshare charges from our street to the same downtown block at odd hours. I checked the safe. Everything was in place, which felt almost like a dare. I opened a new account in my name only at a bank across town and transferred a portion of our liquid savings Harding said I had every right to protect. The printed confirmation went straight to her office, never through email. The storm inside me built pressure. Some nights I left the bed to stand barefoot in the kitchen, palms flat on the counter, breathing in for 4 beats and out for 6 until the black edge retreated from my vision. Rage is a kind of talent. It can make you good at things you should never have to be good at. Mine made me meticulous. I studied metadata like scripture. I learned that a photo taken at 12:43 p.m. tells the truth, even if the face in the frame is smiling over dinner at 7 p.m. I began using the house like a hunter uses the wind, parking 2 blocks away, slipping in through the side gate when the schedule hinted at a lunch at home. I never went upstairs. I already knew what I'd find. Instead, I waited in the mudroom, phone camera aimed at the mirror at the end of the hallway, catching the sliver of our bedroom door it reflected. A shape is still a shape when you know it by heart. 2 shapes are proof. I changed nothing in how I spoke to Vanessa. I asked about faculty memos, the Senate's noise, our daughter's texts. I kissed her cheek in the morning, let the kiss land like a leaf on water. When she reached for me at night with that same urgency, I didn't pull away. Refusing would have been a flare in the dark. Compliance was camouflage. And sometimes, this is the shameful part, I wanted her anyway, not because I was fooled, but because love is a habit the body keeps long after the mind has resigned. Harding called on a Thursday. "You have enough," she said after reviewing my log of dates, screenshots, and time-stamped images no reasonable person could misinterpret. "If you want to proceed, we can draft and file next week." That night, I walked the rooms like a man measuring for a renovation he didn't want. In the closet, I counted suits and ties, not to pack, just to know what leaving would weigh. In the garage, I opened my father's old toolbox, palmed the cold weight of the socket wrench, then put it back. I wasn't allowed the easy story of a broken jaw and a night in a cell. I had chosen a harder narrative, one where my hands stayed clean and the record did the striking for me. Before bed, I made one last list, questions I would not ask when the papers were served. Who started it? How it began? Whether I'd failed in a way she would name. Questions like that have a gravity that can trap a man forever. I would not orbit her new son. I would be an exit. My goal had shifted. I no longer wanted simply to end a marriage. I wanted the ledger to balance. I wanted Vanessa to understand, in documents, in dollars, in the look on our daughters' faces when the truth was undeniable, that betrayal doesn't walk away without paying the bill. I set my alarm, slipped the thumb drive under my pillow like a talisman, and when the house settled and her breathing evened out beside me, I stared at the ceiling and felt the storm inside turn from wind to wire. It was such a small thing that on any other day I might have ignored it. But that morning, standing in the kitchen with the pantry door open, I noticed something odd. The box of cinnamon Pop-Tarts was gone, not just opened. Gone. Vanessa hated them. She used to wrinkle her nose when I ate one, muttering about processed sugar and cardboard crust. Our kids never touched them either. That meant only one thing: someone else had been here, someone who liked them. Julian. The thought landed heavier than I expected. It wasn't about the pastry itself. It was about what it represented. This wasn't just about him taking my wife behind my back. He had crossed into my home, into my space, leaving invisible fingerprints on everything I had built. Suddenly, the pattern sharpened. My favorite mug missing from its hook, only to show up in the dishwasher still wet. A faint trace of cologne I didn't wear in the downstairs bathroom. The occasional men's t-shirts in Vanessa's laundry basket. Shirts I'd never seen before. The Pop-Tarts became a symbol, ridiculous, infuriating, unforgettable. Every time I thought about them, I pictured Julian in my kitchen, opening my pantry, helping himself as if he owned the place. That's when the anger shifted. Until then, it had been focused on the betrayal in bed, the whispers, the moans behind a closed door. But now it was about territory. He wasn't just taking what was mine in some abstract sense. He was physically inside my world, making himself comfortable. I closed the pantry door and took a long, steady breath. If I had needed one final push toward total war, this was it. The Pop-Tart was my trigger. From that moment, every move I made wasn't just about ending the marriage. It was about reclaiming my home, my dignity, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that one day Julian would choke on the taste of what he had stolen. The day the papers landed in her hands, my phone rang before noon. Vanessa's name lit up the screen, the vibration buzzing in my hand like the hum of a distant storm. I let it ring for a moment, just listening to that sound before I finally answered. There was no greeting, only the jagged edge of her voice already breaking. "What is this? Ethan, what the hell is this?" She had clearly read every page. The panic was real, thick in her tone, but I didn't let it touch me. "You've been served," I said, my voice steady, stripped of warmth. "You made your decision a long time ago. I'm just making mine now." She began to plead, her words tumbling over each other, telling me she still loved me, that I was overreacting, that we could talk. The irony bit deep, months of lies wrapped now in a voice that claimed honesty like it was a birthright. "Please," she said, her voice cracking, "just meet me. Let me explain." "No," I replied, simple as a door closing. That afternoon, she called again. I let it go to voicemail. That night, the doorbell rang, and there she was, hair unbrushed, eyes red, clutching the divorce packet like it might burn her fingers. She didn't wait for an invitation before stepping inside. "It was just physical," she blurted. It didn't mean anything. You and I, we can fix this. We have history, Ethan. We have us. I studied her carefully, watching the desperation beneath the practiced tilt of her chin. If it's nothing, I said evenly, then you can give him up, right? She froze, not for long, half a second maybe, but long enough for the truth to seep out between us. Her eyes flickered, and there it was, fear, not fear of losing me, but fear of losing him. That half-second told me more than hours of confession ever could. "You've answered me," I said quietly and walked to the door. I opened it, letting the cool night air spill inside. She didn't move at first, as if hoping I might change my mind. But when I didn't, she stepped past me, still clutching the papers like they were the only thing holding her together. The door clicked shut behind her, and I took the first clean breath I'd had in months. Vanessa sold the idea like it was a peace offering. "Just one session," she said, voice measured, eyes softened in that calculated way she used when she wanted me to agree to something. "If we're ending this, fine, but at least let's say we tried." Part of me wanted to laugh, 23 years together, and now she wanted to try. But I agreed, not because I believed in some last-minute salvation, but because I recognized an opportunity. Harding, my attorney, had been clear, documented attempts at reconciliation, especially those that failed because of her, would serve me well. The therapist's office was warm in a curated way, soft chairs, low lighting, shelves lined with books about connection and healing. Dr. Bennett, a woman in her late 40s with clear eyes and an unflinching posture, welcomed us with the kind of smile that told me she'd seen everything and was rarely surprised. Vanessa started strong. She spoke of our history, raising our daughters, of losing herself in the routine of marriage. She painted Julian as a mistake born of emotional neglect, a lapse that didn't define her. Every sentence was crafted to make her sound like a woman who had simply wandered off the path, not one who had burned it down. I let her talk. Brick by brick, she built her case. Dr. Bennett listened, nodding occasionally, then leaned forward. "Vanessa," she said gently, "if this affair was just a mistake, why haven't you ended it?" Vanessa hesitated too long. "It's complicated." "Is it complicated," Dr. Bennett asked, "or is it that you don't want to give him up?" The question landed like a stone dropped in still water. Vanessa's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Dr. Bennett's tone remained calm, but her words cut clean. "You're describing what I often hear from clients who struggle with addiction. The substance becomes their source of validation, and they convince themselves they can keep it while repairing everything else. But you can't get sober if you keep the bottle in the house." Vanessa flushed. "That's not fair." "It's not meant to be fair," Dr. Bennett replied evenly. "It's meant to be honest. If Ethan forgave you today, could you promise without hesitation that you would remain faithful from this day forward?" The pause was microscopic, but it was there. In that pause, I saw everything I needed to see. The truth she would never say aloud, she couldn't promise. I leaned back, my decision crystallizing into something sharp and unshakable. Therapy wasn't for saving us. It was for documenting the impossibility of saving us. Every word, every flicker of her expression was moral ammunition. When we left, Vanessa walked ahead of me toward the parking lot, her shoulders stiff. She thought I was silent because I was hurt. I was silent because I'd just been handed the final piece of evidence, not for court, but for myself, that this marriage was not only over, it was unsalvageable. It happened 3 days after the therapy session, as if she had been studying my silence and decided it was her opening. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table, her in the same chair she used to grade papers, me with a mug of coffee gone lukewarm between my hands. There was no preamble, no softening of edges. "I've been thinking," she began, her tone oddly businesslike. "Maybe we've been looking at this the wrong way. What if we didn't have to choose?" I raised an eyebrow. "Choose what?" "Between monogamy and what we have now." She leaned forward, eyes bright with a strange conviction. "We could have an open marriage. It's modern, honest. People do it all the time. No more lying, no more sneaking around. We could set boundaries, rules. You could see other people too." For a moment, I just stared at her, trying to decide if this was serious or some warped attempt at humor. Then I laughed, but without warmth. It was the kind of sound that felt like an exhale sharpened to a blade. "You're asking me," I said slowly, "to let you keep betraying me, but with permission." She bristled. "It's not betrayal if we agree to it. This way we could preserve our life together while still letting you have him." I cut in. The pause was short but telling. She didn't deny it. Her confidence cracked just enough for me to see the truth beneath. She had believed utterly that my love for her was a constant, a resource she could draw on no matter how deeply she overdrafted. She thought the history we'd built would make me bend rather than break. "No," I said, "no apology, no qualification, just the word planted between us like a steel post driven into concrete." The shock on her face was unfiltered. For the first time since this began, she looked less like someone scrambling to cover a mistake and more like someone genuinely blindsided. "You'd really throw away everything we've built?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I'm not the one who threw it away," I replied. She sat back, silent now, as if recalculating a game plan she'd been sure would win. But there was nothing left to calculate. The game was over, and she'd just learned she had no leverage left. Harding filed the petition on a Monday morning, the kind of crisp autumn day that should have been reserved for coffee on the porch and a yard full of leaves. Instead, my name and hers went into the court system, black ink on white paper under the grounds of adultery. Harding had warned me it was mostly symbolic. Our state's no-fault laws meant the filing wouldn't alter the division of property by statute. But symbolism matters. It becomes part of the public record. Years from now, anyone who cared to look would see it there in plain language. Marriage dissolved due to infidelity. Vanessa's response came fast and sharp. Her attorney filed a counterclaim denying the alleged conduct and painting our split as the product of irreconcilable differences. It was laughable, irreconcilable differences apparently being the polite way to say sleeping with a younger colleague in your marital bed. Within days, the ripple reached our social circle. Mutual friends split into camps. Some called me quietly, apologizing for what they had suspected but never said. Others stayed silent, their loyalties clear from the absence of their names in my recent calls. A few tried to stay neutral, which I now understood as cowardice dressed up as diplomacy. I never spoke badly about her in public. I didn't need to. Her actions spoke louder than anything I could say. At group events, I let her do the explaining, and each time she stumbled over the edges of her story, I could feel the unspoken verdict turning against her. Behind closed doors, the war was far less polite. Harding and I went line by line through our finances, identifying what could be shielded, what could be strategically leveraged. We flagged accounts in my name only, assets acquired before the marriage, retirement funds protected by state law. We examined every piece of marital property to see what I could claim without looking vindictive. I closed joint credit cards, rerouted direct deposits, and froze the home equity line she sometimes used for emergencies. I knew she'd notice. I wanted her to. That shock, realizing the faucet had been turned off, would be her first taste of what life without my resources would feel like. I told myself I wasn't out to ruin her financially. I repeated it more than once. But I was committed to ensuring she walked away with far less than the comfortable settlement she imagined. Every dollar saved was a reminder that consequences aren't just emotional. They are logistical, tangible, and cold. At night, alone in the house, I'd pull out the folder Harding had built. Receipts, call logs, photographs, screenshots, all organized so neatly it looked like a prosecution exhibit. In truth, that's exactly what it was. My case wasn't only about ending a marriage. It was about closing a ledger on 23 years and making sure the final balance sheet reflected exactly who had withdrawn more than they ever deposited. The divorce war had begun, and I intended to win, not with shouting, not with rumor, but with precision. Quiet, calculated precision. Vanessa packed quickly, as if speed alone could keep the weight of what she was doing from settling on her shoulders. She told herself it was freedom, that moving in with Julian was a choice, not a consequence. For the first few weeks, it was everything she thought she wanted. No more stolen afternoons or whispered goodbyes. No more rearranging alibis or checking the clock to make sure she got home before suspicion had time to bloom. They could wake up tangled together, make coffee without glancing over their shoulders, fall asleep without setting alarms for separate exits. The passion was constant, almost exhausting. Without boundaries, it spilled into every available space. Days blurred into each other, ordering takeout, watching movies half-heartedly before abandoning them for the bedroom again. Vanessa told herself this was what love looked like when obstacles were gone, pure, unfiltered, unstoppable. But the absence of secrecy removed more than the fear of being caught. It stripped away the false urgency that had made their affair feel vital. Without the ticking clock and high stakes, conversations began to stretch into awkward silences. Vanessa discovered Julian had little interest in her life outside the bed. He didn't ask about her work unless it intersected with his. He had no curiosity about her children beyond a polite nod when she mentioned them. His attention was easy to win physically, but it ended there, like a switch that could be flipped on and off at will. Julian, for his part, seemed perfectly content to keep things light. He enjoyed the sex, there was no doubt, but he had no appetite for the depth that comes with a shared life. 15 years younger, he was still comfortably self-centered, still building a career, still keeping his options wide open. Commitment for him was just another word for compromise, and compromise had no appeal. Vanessa saw hints of this early, the way he dodged questions about the future, how his tone shifted when she spoke about our place instead of your place, the moments he called their life fun rather than real. But she didn't dwell on them. She had sacrificed too much to get here. Admitting the cracks now would mean admitting the fire had been for nothing. So she clung to the story she'd told herself from the start, that their connection was rare, unbreakable, worth every loss. She told herself he just needed time to adjust to living together, to settle into a rhythm not built on adrenaline. She ignored the late nights he spent out without explanation, the unanswered texts until morning, the glances he gave other women that looked uncomfortably familiar. If she noticed the difference between the man who had risked everything to have her and the man who now shared her rent, she didn't let herself name it. Naming it would mean facing the truth, and the truth was still the one thing she wasn't ready to see. I had avoided this moment for as long as I could, not because I doubted the truth of what I had to say, but because I knew that once the words were spoken, they would hang in the air forever, unchangeable, impossible to take back. It was a Sunday afternoon, the kind of quiet day we used to spend together as a family, coffee, newspapers, maybe a walk if the weather was kind. I asked both of them to come by. My tone was calm, my request casual, but inside I could already feel the weight pressing down. They sat across from me at the kitchen table, two women now, no longer the little girls who once swung their feet from these chairs. I looked at them, seeing traces of their mother in their faces, and began. "I need to explain why your mother and I are separating," I said, keeping my voice even, my words plain. "Your mother has been in a relationship with someone else. It's been going on for months, I found out, and I can't stay married under those circumstances." The younger one's face crumpled instantly, a mixture of disbelief, anger, and hurt. "So you're just giving up, you're breaking up our family over a mistake?" The older one was silent, her eyes locked on mine, searching for cracks in what I'd just said. "Is it true?" she finally asked. I nodded. "Yes." I didn't add details, no names, no photographs, no timelines. They didn't need the forensic version of the truth. The fact itself was enough. Vanessa must have sensed what I'd done because within hours she was on the phone to both of them, spinning her own version. She called it a rough patch, claimed I was overreacting, painted herself as a woman who'd been lonely in her own marriage. I didn't interrupt her narrative. I didn't try to compete with it. I knew the damage she'd done to herself was beyond my reach and beyond repair. The younger one clung to her mother's version for a while. Her anger toward me was sharper than her anger at the betrayal itself. I was easier to confront than the parent she still wanted to believe in. But the older one, she stayed quiet for a few days, then called me late one night. "I think you were right," she said softly. I asked her questions she wouldn't answer, And I remembered things, the nights she was gone, the way she'd act when she got a text. I think I just didn't want to see it. It wasn't victory. There's nothing to win in moments like these, but it was truth, acknowledged, shared. Vanessa's standing with them would never be the same. Maybe they would still love her. Love has a way of surviving what it shouldn't. But they would never again see her as the mother who once read them bedtime stories and kissed scraped knees without hesitation. When they left, the house felt emptier than it ever had. I realized something then. The marriage had ended the day I discovered the truth. But the family ended today. For Julian, the thrill had begun to fade months before he admitted it to himself. At first, Vanessa had been intoxicating, confident, experienced, a woman who made him feel like the center of gravity in every room they entered. She carried herself with a poise that drew eyes without asking for them. To Julian, she had been both a conquest and a rush, but living together stripped away the fantasy. He began noticing things he once ignored, the way she corrected him mid-story, how she bristled when he made plans without her, the subtle but constant reminders of the 15-year age gap between them. Julian wasn't cruel by nature, but he was honest with himself about what he wanted, a future still wide open, full of possibility. He pictured having children someday, building a life with someone who could grow into the years with him, not someone already past them. That thought alone made their apartment feel smaller. Then came Lucy, 24, all long limbs and effortless laughter, a dancer's grace that seemed to shift the air around her. They met at an art gallery opening, Lucy invited by a friend of a friend. And from the first conversation, Julian felt the magnetic pull of novelty. She talked about backpacking across Europe, opening her own dance studio, maybe moving to New York. She was all forward momentum, no baggage. Once Lucy was in the picture, Vanessa began to feel less like an adventure and more like a detour. Julian avoided their apartment more often, lingering at the university or working late. The passion that had once filled entire weekends was replaced by polite obligation. He stopped reaching for her in bed. She noticed, of course she did, but she convinced herself it was stress, distraction, anything but the truth. When Julian finally decided to end it, he didn't stage a candlelit conversation or soften it with metaphors. One Thursday evening, as she folded laundry, he stood in the doorway and said it plain. "We need to talk." The conversation was short, almost transactional. "I'm not your forever Vanessa," he said, meeting her eyes without flinching. "I never was. You left your husband for a couple of years of great sex. That's all this was, and now it's over." Her mouth opened, but no words came. Shock, denial, humiliation, they flickered across her face in seconds. She wanted to remind him of what they'd risked, of what she'd given up. But his tone made it clear. He wasn't asking for understanding. He was delivering a verdict. Within a week, he was gone. The apartment felt half empty, and so did she, surrounded by reminders of a gamble that had cost her everything and paid out nothing. Julian's absence was louder than his presence had ever been. Vanessa woke to silence where there used to be the rustle of sheets, the low hum of his voice, the warmth of a body beside her. Now there was only the hollow echo of a choice she could never undo. At first, she told herself it was just a breakup, something she'd recover from the way she always had in her 20s and 30s. But this was different. This wasn't the loss of a fling or the end of a casual romance. This was the collapse of the one thing she had gambled everything on. And she had no home to return to, no marriage to retreat into. Ethan had closed that door long before Julian walked out. The sting wasn't just emotional, it was social. Friends who once laughed with her over wine nights now sent polite excuses when she suggested meeting up. The whispers were inevitable in a town this size. She left her husband for that younger guy, and he left her. Mutual acquaintances gravitated toward Ethan, not because they were loyal to him, but because siding with the wronged party was easier than defending the one who had burned it all down. She tried dating again, partly to prove to herself she still could, partly to fill the hours that now stretched unbearably long. But the dating pool was nothing like she remembered. Younger men were quick to swipe right but quicker to expect physical immediacy she no longer found flattering. Older men came with their own scars, their own rules, and above all, a need for trust. Trust she no longer carried. Each rejection, whether subtle or blunt, pressed the truth deeper. She had traded a quarter-century of stability, loyalty, and shared history for something fleeting, something that had evaporated in under 2 years. She had bet on passion as a foundation, and now she stood alone in the rubble. Nights were the worst. She'd scroll through old photos of herself and Julian, trying to remember the intoxication that once made her certain she'd chosen right. Instead, she found herself wondering if Julian had ever loved her at all, or if she'd simply been a thrill ride he was always destined to step off. It was a thought she tried to push away, but it clung to her like the smell of smoke after a fire. And the more she sat in that empty apartment, the more she understood. This was her bottom, and there was no one coming to pull her up. It was a Thursday evening, the kind of night when the air was cool enough for a jacket but not cold enough to hurry home. I'd stopped by a small liquor store near my apartment to pick up a bottle of Añejo tequila, a quiet indulgence for weekends I spent alone. I was scanning the shelves when a voice beside me said, "You've got good taste." I turned to see a woman with auburn hair loosely braided over one shoulder, her eyes bright with that rare mix of curiosity and calm. She wore jeans, a leather jacket, and an easy smile, the kind that felt like an invitation rather than an intrusion. "Guess we're competing for the last one," I said, glancing at the single bottle between us. "Tell you what," she replied, "you take it this time, but you have to promise me a glass if I run into you again." Her name was Clara Hayes. We started talking right there in the aisle, the way strangers sometimes do when the timing is unguarded enough. She told me she liked tequila because it reminded her of summer trips to Mexico before her life had been rewritten by betrayal. Her ex-husband had left her for a co-worker, messy, public, final. She spoke without bitterness, like someone who had made peace with the wreckage but never forgotten how it felt to stand in it. I found myself laughing at her dry humor, surprised at how quickly the heaviness in my chest seemed to lift. She didn't ask for the details of my past, didn't pry. Instead, she shared small, honest fragments of her own life, the way you might with someone you've known for years but just happened to meet. We left the store together, standing under the streetlight with the bottle cradled in a paper bag. "If you're serious about that glass," I said, "there's a bar a few blocks from here that does a good pour." She hesitated, just enough to make me think she might say no, then smiled. "Lead the way." The bar was dim, the kind where the bartender knows how to give people space. Over 2 drinks, we found a rhythm, joking, swapping anecdotes, letting conversations drift into easy silences that felt like rest instead of distance. For the first time in years, I felt something stir that wasn't anger or obligation. Clara wasn't a rescue. She wasn't a rebound. She was simply a spark, a reminder that connection didn't have to be built on history or necessity. Sometimes it could start in a liquor store aisle over the last bottle on the shelf. And maybe, just maybe, it could lead to something worth keeping. It was a Friday evening, and the office was already emptying out when Sophie Lang appeared at my doorway. Coat draped over one arm, phone in the other, that familiar smirk playing at her lips. Sophie was one of the youngest in the department, sharp, ambitious, and refreshingly unfiltered. She leaned against the door frame. "So," she said, "are you going to call the tequila woman, or are you planning to make small talk with her in your head for the next 6 months?" I chuckled, shaking my head. "It's not that simple." "It's exactly that simple," she replied, stepping into my office. "You like her, she likes you. Unless she's in the witness protection program, you can probably get her number. What's the holdup?" I sighed, leaning back in my chair. "I'm out of practice. My last first date was before smartphones." "Which means," she said, sliding into the chair across from me, "you get to skip all the nonsense and actually enjoy yourself. Look, Ethan, I've seen you in meetings. You're confident, you listen, you make people feel heard. That's half the battle in dating. The other half is not letting your past dictate every move you make now." We ended up at a quiet bar downtown, 2 glasses of wine in, Sophie dismantling my excuses one by one. She teased me for hiding in divorce purgatory and gave me a crash course in body language. Eye contact, leaning in, the subtle signals that say I'm interested without reeking of desperation. "You've been through hell," she said, her tone softening, "but you're still standing. That's attractive. Own it." I studied her for a moment, realizing she was right. I'd been treating my divorce like a warning label, something that would scare off anyone new before they even had a chance to know me. But Clara wasn't Vanessa, and I wasn't the same man I'd been 2 years ago. By the time Sophie pushed her empty glass away, something in me had shifted. Not a dramatic epiphany, just a quiet certainty that I had nothing to lose by trying. "Call her," Sophie said, tossing a 20 on the table for her share. "Tonight, not tomorrow, not next week. And don't you dare send a text. Use your voice." That night, I sat on my couch with my phone in hand, staring at Clara's number. I thought about Sophie's grin, her relentless confidence on my behalf. Then I hit call. Clara picked up on the second ring, her voice warm with surprise. By the time we hung up, we had a dinner planned for Saturday, and for the first time in years, I was looking forward to a date. Not to prove anything, but because it might just be the start of something real. I had promised myself one thing when I started seeing Clara: no rushing. My last marriage had taught me that speed was never the problem. It was the quiet erosion, the slow rot beneath the surface that destroyed it. With Clara, I wanted something different, something deliberate. Our first few months together settled into an easy rhythm: dinners, coffee dates, long walks in the park. Neither of us pretended our pasts didn't exist. We talked about them, not obsessively, but honestly, like people discussing old injuries that still ached in certain weather. Clara told me about the day she found a hotel receipt in her ex-husband's jacket pocket, how it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. I told her about standing in my own hallway, hearing voices from the bedroom that rewrote 23 years of marriage in a single breath. Those conversations didn't push us apart. They stitched something between us. There was no need to hide the worst parts. We had both already survived them. Trust came in small, almost invisible ways. When I left my phone on the table, Clara didn't so much as glance at it. When she mentioned an old friend from college, a man, I didn't feel that familiar spike of suspicion. When one of us had a bad day, the other's first instinct was to listen, not to fix. Joy returned in quiet increments. Cooking together on Friday nights, mock arguing over whether cilantro belonged in salsa. Weekend trips to small towns just far enough away to feel like escapes. Reading side by side on lazy Sunday mornings, the silence between us warm rather than weighted. One morning, as I poured coffee, I realized I hadn't thought about Vanessa in days. Not because she had disappeared from my memory, but because Clara filled the present so completely. Clara wasn't Vanessa. She didn't demand attention like a spotlight, didn't treat love as a performance. She was steady, grounded, and real. And that, I realized, was exactly why she was right for me. Vanessa's life after Julian became a series of stumbles disguised as fresh starts. She dated sporadically. Men from dating apps, old acquaintances, even a divorced neighbor who seemed promising until he confessed he still had feelings for his ex. Nothing lasted. Each relationship began with cautious optimism and ended with the same hollow conclusion. No one wanted to take on the weight she carried. Her body began to betray her too. A sudden health scare, a suspicious mammogram, followed by a month of anxious tests, forced her to face a truth she had been avoiding. She wasn't young anymore. Nights out drinking until sunrise no longer felt adventurous. They felt exhausting. Menopause brought its own unwelcome guests: hot flashes, restless sleep, mood swings she couldn't always control. She tried yoga, meditation, even clean eating for a month. But old habits were hard to break when they had been armor for so long. Her daughters kept their distance at first, polite but cool. Over time, they softened, perhaps deciding that punishment had run its course. There were tentative dinners, a few shared holidays, the occasional phone call for advice, but the gap never fully closed. Vanessa could feel it in their hugs, warm but never as unguarded as before. The disappointment lingered in their eyes, a shadow she couldn't banish no matter how many apologies she offered. The hardest moments came without warning. Once, while running errands, she saw Ethan across the street, his arm draped casually around the shoulders of a woman with auburn hair and a laugh that seemed to brighten the air around them. Clara. They weren't doing anything spectacular, just walking, talking, moving with the kind of ease that comes from trust. Vanessa froze, watching them disappear into a coffee shop. The sight wasn't just a reminder of what she'd lost. It was proof of what she would never get back. Ethan's happiness didn't look like revenge, but it felt like it. Not because he had tried to hurt her, but because he had built something whole in the space where she had left only ruins. That night, alone in her apartment, she opened a bottle of wine she had been saving for a special occasion. She drank half of it before realizing there was nothing to celebrate. The city hummed outside her window, but inside the silence was absolute. She had made her choices, and now she was living in the echo of them. 2 years had passed since the ink dried on the divorce papers, but time had worked unevenly on its two subjects. Ethan arrived at the annual holiday gala with Clara on his arm. They were dressed in winter elegance, Ethan in a tailored charcoal suit, Clara in a deep green velvet dress that made her auburn hair shimmer under the lights. They moved through the room with an easy rhythm, laughing, exchanging warm greetings, never clinging to each other, yet always connected. Vanessa was already there, standing near the buffet table with a glass of champagne she hadn't touched. She wore a black cocktail dress that might once have commanded attention, but under the harsh overhead lighting, it emphasized the wear in her features. Her smile was too deliberate, her posture too rigid, as if she were holding herself together with sheer will. The moment she spotted Ethan, the air shifted. Mutual acquaintances noticed too, heads tilted, eyes darted. Conversations softened to murmurs. Someone near the bar whispered, "If there's such a thing as winning a breakup, I think we're looking at it." Ethan heard the murmurs but didn't let them slow his pace. Clara gave his arm a light squeeze, an unspoken "I've got you." They approached Vanessa out of courtesy, not obligation. "Vanessa," Ethan said, his tone even and polite, the way you might greet a former colleague. "Ethan," she replied, forcing a brightness into her voice that didn't quite reach her eyes. "It's been a while." Clara offered a warm but measured smile. "Nice to meet you. I've heard a lot about this event." Vanessa's gaze lingered on Clara for a moment too long, as if measuring her or perhaps trying to decide whether she was real or just another wound to absorb. "You look well," Vanessa finally said, turning back to Ethan. "Thanks," he replied simply. "We've been keeping busy." They exchanged a few lines of small talk, the weather, the turnout, the catering. But the conversation was fragile, every word teetering on the edge of something unsaid. Ethan kept it brief, unwilling to let nostalgia or pity take root. "Well," he said at last, "good to see you." And with that, he and Clara moved on, disappearing into the crowd as easily as they'd entered. Vanessa watched them go, her champagne still untouched, the sound of their laughter trailing faintly behind. For the rest of the evening, she could feel eyes on her. Not in admiration, but in quiet judgment, the way people look at a cautionary tale. And somewhere deep down, she knew the whispers were right. Ethan hadn't just survived, he had rebuilt. It was a gray Thursday afternoon when her name appeared on my phone for the first time in months. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail, but curiosity won. "Ethan," she began, her tone light but careful, "I was wondering if you might want to catch up sometime, just as friends." There was a pause long enough for me to hear her inhale. I could picture her rehearsing the call in the mirror, trying different inflections until she thought she had the right one. I said yes, but only to lunch in a public place. Neutral ground. When she walked into the restaurant a week later, she looked deliberate. Her hair perfectly styled, makeup just dramatic enough, a deep burgundy wrap dress that flattered her figure. It was an intentional choice, the kind meant to stir memory. For a moment, I almost admired the effort. We exchanged pleasantries, ordered, and settled into conversation. Vanessa leaned in when she spoke, perfume a faint echo of our shared past. She asked about my work, my health, my daughters. Then, with practiced subtlety, she began weaving in references to the life we'd once had, holidays abroad, quiet Sunday mornings, the comfort of a shared home. "I miss us," she said finally, her eyes steady on mine. "We had something real. I didn't realize how rare that was." I took a sip of water, letting the silence carry the weight before I spoke. We did have something real, but I think what we have now, our separate lives, that's what's right. She didn't flinch, but a shadow crossed her expression. She tried again, asking if I'd ever wondered what might have been different if things hadn't ended the way they did. "I don't think about what ifs anymore," I said simply. "Clara is my future. I'm not looking back." The rest of the meal stayed in safe territory: movies, mutual acquaintances, the weather. When the check came, I insisted on splitting it. Outside, we stood for a moment in the mild afternoon air. "Well," she said, forcing a smile, "I'm glad we did this." "Me too," I replied, and I meant it not because I wanted her back, but because this meeting confirmed what I already knew. There was nothing left between us but history. I walked away without looking over my shoulder. She stayed where she was for a moment, watching me disappear into the crowd. She had come hoping to spark something that could undo the past, but all she found was the certainty that my life had moved on, and hers was still searching for a place to land. It wasn't a grand, cinematic moment. No fireworks, no crowd of strangers applauding. Just a quiet Sunday morning in late autumn, the kind where sunlight slanted through the blinds in golden strips and the air outside carried the crisp promise of winter. Clara was curled up on the couch, wearing one of my old sweatshirts, her hair slightly mussed from sleep. She had a book open in her lap, though she'd been reading the same page for 10 minutes, distracted by the smell of coffee drifting from the kitchen. I stood there for a moment just watching her. I'd proposed once before in my life in a fancy restaurant with a ring hidden in a champagne flute. That proposal had been met with tears and applause, and years later, betrayal. I didn't want that again. This time I wanted truth, simplicity, no performance, just a promise. I sat beside her, placing the small velvet box on the coffee table between us. She looked at it, then at me, her brows knitting slightly. "I don't need a speech," I said. "I just need you to know that I want to spend the rest of my life with you, not because it's convenient, not because I'm afraid to be alone, but because you make the present feel better than any past I've ever had." Her eyes softened, filling with tears. She didn't bother to blink away. She closed the book, set it aside, and reached for my hand. "Yes," she said without hesitation. I slid the ring onto her finger. Not an elaborate diamond, but a simple band set with a small sapphire, deep and steady, like the way she had been with me since the day we met. We stayed there for a while, just holding each other, the morning stretching out in front of us like something we could build on. I didn't feel the rush I'd once mistaken for love. I felt something far better, certainty. Somewhere in another part of the city, Vanessa might have been starting her day, chasing distractions, maybe wondering how things had turned out this way. But in that moment, her story no longer touched mine. My life was here with Clara, and that was enough. It happened quietly, no dramatic scene, no shouting, no final confrontation. Just a letter from her landlord slipped under the door one Tuesday morning. A polite but firm notice. The building had been sold, rents were increasing, and she had 60 days to vacate. She read it twice before setting it down, her coffee growing cold beside her. It wasn't just the apartment she was losing. It was the last place that still felt like hers, even in its emptiness. Every move she'd made in the past 2 years had been reactive, scrambling to hold on to what little stability she had left. Now even that was slipping away. She tried calling a few friends, but the conversations were brief, awkward. Most had their own lives, their own problems. Offers of help came in the form of polite suggestions rather than concrete action. Maybe you could look for a roommate. Or, have you thought about moving back closer to family? Her daughters listened when she told them, but neither offered to have her move in. The older one suggested a smaller place in a different neighborhood, something easier to manage. The younger one said she'd help pack when the time came, but her tone carried a distance Vanessa couldn't ignore. The truth was, there was no home waiting for her anywhere. She had burned that bridge when she left Ethan. Not just the house, but the feeling of belonging that came with it. On her last night in the apartment, surrounded by boxes, she opened a bottle of wine and sat on the floor. The walls looked bare without the photos and paintings she'd once hung to make the space feel alive. Outside, the city kept moving, cars passing, voices drifting up from the street, indifferent to her small collapse. She thought about calling Julian but stopped herself. She knew exactly how that conversation would go. Polite, distant, maybe even a little guilty, but with no offer to meet, no suggestion of rekindling anything. The next morning, she handed over the keys and walked away without looking back. The loss wasn't just of a place. It was the final piece of the life she'd once imagined for herself. Vanessa had made her choices, and now there was nothing left to lose. The morning began with sunlight pouring through the tall windows of the small vineyard estate we had chosen, a place far enough from the city to feel like an escape, but close enough that our families could be there without a long journey. The air carried the scent of lavender from the garden, mingling with the faint sweetness of freshly baked bread from the kitchen. Clara had insisted on keeping it simple. No grand ballroom, no endless guest list. Just the people who mattered, the ones who had walked beside us through the long climb from heartbreak to here. I stood at the altar beneath a wooden arch draped in white fabric and wildflowers, watching as she stepped into view. She wore an ivory gown that seemed to belong to her as naturally as her own skin, nothing overly ornate, just clean lines and quiet elegance. Her auburn hair caught the light, and when she smiled, I felt the same pull I had in that liquor store aisle all those months ago. The ceremony was brief, but each word landed with weight. When I slid the ring onto her finger, my hands were steady. No rush, no nerves, only certainty. We exchanged vows we had written ourselves. Mine spoke of trust rebuilt, of finding joy in the small moments. Hers promised partnership, patience, and the kind of love that doesn't fade when the world gets hard. After the officiant pronounced us husband and wife, we walked back down the aisle to the sound of applause and the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. No confetti, no fireworks, just sunlight, laughter, and the steady heartbeat of a day that felt entirely our own. At the reception, there was good food, a few heartfelt toasts, and dancing under strings of warm lights as the sky deepened into evening. I caught myself watching Clara talk with my daughters, their faces lit with genuine smiles, and knew in that moment that the fractures of the past had finally been replaced with something whole. Somewhere out there, Vanessa still existed in her own story, but she was no longer part of mine. My life was here, anchored, steady, and exactly where I wanted to be. It was early evening when the last of the guests left the vineyard. The laughter and clinking glasses had faded into the distance, replaced by the steady hum of cicadas in the warm summer air. Clara and I stood together under the same wooden arch where we'd exchanged vows hours earlier, the white fabric now swaying gently in the breeze. She leaned her head against my shoulder, and I felt the weight of the years before her, the chaos, the betrayal, the endless rebuilding, finally settle into the past where it belonged. There was no grand epiphany, no surge of triumphant music in my head, just a quiet knowing. I had fought my battles, lost more than I ever thought I could, and still found my way to this moment. Not through revenge, not through proving anyone wrong, but by choosing the life I wanted instead of dwelling on the one I'd lost. We walked slowly toward the vineyard house, our steps unhurried. Inside, the remnants of the day lingered, half-empty wine glasses, a forgotten bouquet, the faint echo of music from the speakers. Clara laughed softly at the sight, then began gathering plates, and without speaking, I joined her. It struck me that peace didn't feel like the absence of struggle. It felt like partnership in its simplest form. Two people moving through the same space without tension, without fear, without the constant need to defend themselves. Later, we sat on the porch with the last of the wine, watching the sun sink below the rolling hills. The sky shifted from gold to deep indigo, and the first stars began to appear. I thought of Vanessa, not with anger, not with longing, just as a chapter that had closed. Whatever she was doing now was her story to carry. Mine was here, with the woman beside me in the home we would build together in the quiet promise of nights like this. Peace wasn't something I had stumbled into. It was something I had chosen. And in that choice, I found everything I had been missing. The apartment she'd finally settled into was smaller than anything she'd lived in before. 2 rooms, thin walls, a window that looked out onto the brick side of another building. It was quiet, almost too quiet, the kind of silence that let old memories sneak in without warning. Vanessa sat at the small kitchen table, a half-empty cup of tea growing cold in front of her. On the wall hung a single framed photo, her daughters at a summer picnic years ago, both smiling without restraint, their faces still untouched by the shadows that would come later. She traced the rim of her mug with one finger, thinking about the choices that had led her here. She remembered the rush of those early days with Julian, the way it had felt like stepping into sunlight after years in a dim room. She had convinced herself that thrill was love, that risk was proof of passion. But passion had faded and risk had turned into loss. She thought of Ethan, of the life they had built and the one she had thrown away. She imagined him now, married, steady, surrounded by people who trusted him. She had once been part of that circle, and she had set fire to it with her own hands. There was no anger left, not even at herself, just an ache, deep and persistent, for something she could never return to. She wondered if there had been a single moment, a single decision, where she could have chosen differently and kept it all intact. But the truth was simpler and sharper. She had wanted more, and in reaching for it, she had lost everything. Outside, the late afternoon light shifted, casting long shadows across the floor. Vanessa stood, rinsed her cup, and set it upside down on the rack. There was nothing left to say to anyone, no gesture that could change the ending. Her life would go on in smaller rooms and quieter places, with memories that never quite settled and lessons that came too late. And so that's where this story ends. A life rebuilt, a love rediscovered, and a betrayal left to wither in the past. Ethan didn't just win a divorce, he reclaimed himself. Vanessa, on the other hand, learned too late that some bridges, once burned, are gone forever. Betrayal always comes with a cost, and in this case it was everything she had. What would you have done if you were in Ethan's shoes? Would you have taken the same quiet, calculated revenge, or something far more direct? Share your thoughts below. I'd love to hear your perspective. And don't forget, you're watching Cheating Stories 7. If you enjoyed this video, hit that like button, subscribe for more stories like this, and leave a comment to join the conversation. Until next time, take care, and remember, trust is a treasure worth protecting.